Chapter 36 is population ecology. Now remember, a population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area at the same time. They are using the same resources, they're sharing a common gene pool, and so forth. Now, previously, you learned about population genetics in Hardy-Weinberg. Now we're looking at population ecology. This includes things like population growth, population demographics, and so on and so forth. The first video will cover the basics. Now, some vocabulary terms. Population size is the number of individuals in the population, the total number. Population density is the total number of individuals per unit area. Okay. Now, in your notes, I mentioned the capture mark recapture method as a way to indirectly figure out how big a population is in nature. Population dispersion is the way that individuals space themselves in the population. In your book, it mentions three of them. A clumped pattern, where you have a cluster of individuals, another cluster, another cluster. That's pretty common in nature for a variety of reasons. A uniform pattern, where they're evenly spaced, and again, territorial behavior will tend to lead itself to a uniform dispersion pattern. And random dispersion, which is no pattern at all, which is actually kind of uncommon in nature. Now, Section 3 discusses survivor curves and reproductive strategy. There are a lot of graphs in this chapter, so you have to pay attention to the graphs. Here we have three survivor curves, type 1, type 2, type 3. Now, on the x-axis, it is percentage of maximum lifespan. So the total lifespan is not what we're plotting. We're plotting how many individuals get to the total lifespan. So this is when the individual is first born or hatched, halfway through the lifespan, into the lifespan. The y-axis is how many you have alive at each age. Now, with a type 1 curve, and we humans tend to exhibit a type 1 curve, the greatest chance of death is toward the end of the lifespan. Now, reproductive strategy. This is typical of any species that produces relatively few offspring, but invests a lot of parental care for their survival. So most of the offspring, vast majority of offspring survive into toward the end of the lifespan. The opposite is a type 3 survivor curve. Oysters are type 3. Here, the greatest chance of death is early in the lifespan. So this is typical of a species that produces huge numbers of offspring, but invests no parental care in their survival. So the oysters, they produce a large number of planktonic larval stages. Most of them aren't going to make it to oysterhood, but a few that do are set for life. Now these represent continuums. Now something right in the middle is called a type 2 curve, in which case the chance of death is statistically the same at any age for whatever reason. So squirrels are pretty much type 2-ish. They produce more offspring than a human, but not as much as an oyster. They'll have more parental care than an oyster, but not as much as a human. So these are life strategies. Now, the next thing your chapter discusses is population growth patterns. Now, with growth, you can look at it on both a global scale and a local scale. Globally, only two things matter: birth rate and death rate. But on a local scale, you can have birth rate, death rate, but also immigration and emigration, animals coming and going from the population. Now, on this graph, it shows growth patterns. The blue one exhibits what's known as biotic potential and exponential growth. Any population under ideal conditions will grow at its maximum possible rate, and that maximum rate is called the biotic potential. So if that is realized, you have exponential growth of the population. But conditions are not always ideal. So what you often have is when population grows, so does resistance to further growth, and eventually it balances out and levels off at a particular level. So the carrying capacity, logistic growth, the carrying capacity is defined as the population size that an environment can support. Okay? So that's what you see in nature typically. You don't see exponential growth indefinitely. You see carrying capacity. Now, factors that limit population growth. That is, what is causing this thing to level out and stay there. Density-dependent factors, such as disease or parasitism or competition. The more dense the population, the worse these factors are for the individual. Okay? But there's also density-independent factors, such as weather and climate. They also limit population growth, irregardless of density. So if it's too cold, it's too cold. If it's too dry, it's too dry. It doesn't matter what the density is. So you have both of these things working together, and you need to know which one is which from your notes. In section 6, it discusses the fact that oftentimes in nature, carrying capacities are not always flat and steady. They tend to fluctuate as conditions fluctuate. An example of a fluctuating carrying capacity is a boom-bust cycle. Boom-bust cycles are seen in simple predator-prey relationships. So read your notes in your textbook on the account of the lynx and the snowshoe hare, how their populations each do this as they affect each other. Now, section 7 discusses how natural selection can affect reproductive strategies. There's a discussion on guppies and how guppies in different bodies of water having different predators have selection in different directions, whether one favors larger body size of adults and the other may favor smaller body size of adults depending upon what the predator is. Now this concludes the basics, and part 2 of the video will focus on human populations.